Hi, my name's Robin Colbert. I am taking, what is this class? Science 133, Physical Science. So this is my lab for Lab 1, Week 1. And basically, we're still talking about what we were learning about in the readings, which was mostly mass, density, and volume. So the experiment that we did, or excuse me, the lab that we did, is talking about all three of those things still. So the main principle that was being discussed in the lab was Archimedes' principle, which talks about buoyancy. And Archimedes' principle basically says that, sorry, I have to look at my notes, that the buoyant force of an object is equal to the weight of the fluid displaced or pushed away by the object. So Archimedes' principle basically explained why objects will sink or float. So in the lab, in Lab 1, you had to take in the simulation just different objects that were on the shelf. So it was, I want to say it was about 10 objects. So it was wood, aluminum, plastic, lead, cork, steel, clay, rubber, and part of a candle. And first you put them on the scale to see what their mass was. And mass is basically the amount of matter in the object, but it's different from the weight. So anyway, you had to put on the scale to find out what the mass was. After you put it in on the scale, you put it inside basically like a canister of water, and there was a beaker underneath the canister because there was like a kind of like a faucet type of thing inside the canister, and the water would displace into the graduated cylinder. So once you place the object in there, the water would displace into the cylinder, and then I measured how much water each object displaced. So there was a trend with which objects would sink or float, because I also had to predict which objects would sink or float. And there were kind of clues a little bit in the beginning to help figure out which ones might sink or float. Sorry, I have to go back through my notes again. So there was like a sidebar that basically gave directions and a couple of things to note. And it said that if the object displaces water greater than or equal to its weight, it will float. And if an object has more mass and weight than the water displaced, it will sink. So I'm trying to think. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. So that kind of gave me a little bit of an idea of what to kind of predict, because you had to make a prediction about whether each object would sink or float after you saw how much of the water was displaced. So basically the trend that I noticed when I figured out the density, so to get the density you had to take the mass of each object and then divide that by the volume, and that gives you the density. So once I was able to get the density of each object, that would also help me to figure out a correlation between whether it would sink or float or not. So the objects that sank when I was testing them were aluminum, lead, clay, steel, and rubber. So the density for all of those were above the mass for water. So the mass for water is 1 milliliter or 1 cubic centimeter if you're talking about the volume. So if the object's density was over 1 milliliter, or the mass of water, it was going to sink. But if it was either less than or equal to the mass of water, it was going to float. So the objects that did actually float were the oak wood, the plastic, the cork, and the candle, and then everything else sank. So that was the experiment in a nutshell. And so basically, it was just testing the density of various objects to see which ones would sink or float. And so the closer that it was to the mass of the water, then or excuse me, the closer it was to the mass of the water, it was going to float. But if it was greater than the mass of the water, then it sank. So I think that's it. And thanks for listening. Bye.